Kia ora koutou, if I can have your attention, thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa, ki te tari tai whenua ahu e maihi ana, ko te pō tuarua, tōko rupu mahi, ko Marilyn Little, tōko ingoa. What you heard there was me talking to one of the organising group because we're starting late and I was trying to get some clarity about when we needed to finish. So, we'll run to 11:30. Right, new instructions. We're running to 11:30, which means we've got an hour and 15 minutes. So, this session we'll discuss the mahi that government, academics, civil society are doing to understand online extremism in Aotearoa and to keep us safe from it. I work, as you heard from my very short mihi, at Te Tari Tai Whenua, the Department of Internal Affairs, and we sit within what I describe as an increasingly complex on and offline ecosystem. And we're working within that to protect New Zealanders, whilst on the other hand, respecting the rights for people to lawfully express opinions online. So we're a regulator, and as a regulator, we aim to deliver a balance of prevention, deterrence, and prosecution. And we do that within the framework of the Films, Videos, and Publications Classification Act of 1993, henceforth known as the Classification Act. Look, there are really high thresholds for state intervention online, and I want everybody in the room to be really clear that the Department of Internal Affairs considers that this is as it should be. Moving on to our mahi, we're really focused on ensuring content that is deemed objectionable by the Chief Censor and is therefore illegal finds no safe harbour here. That's at the heart of what we do in our digital safety function. And in 2021, we undertook 614 investigations of URLs that were either identified by us ourselves, reported to us by the public, or referred to us by our partners. 286 of those URLs were found to contain objectionable content. And when we look at the 5-year trend, what we're seeing is that we're getting increasing numbers of referrals. There's an exponential rise. To try and deal with that inflow, we work with both domestic and international partners to try and get that content removed from the internet, both in Aotearoa but also in other jurisdictions. That relies on good relationships with the platforms. Many of those platforms are responsive to our requests. Unfortunately, and this will come as no surprise, there are also platforms that are at best uncooperative and at worst resistant to our requests that objectionable content be removed. One of our challenges is working within the 30-year-old Classification Act framework. As you will hear from Nick Law, who will be the last of our speakers today, the government knows that the Classification Act needs fundamental change. It's, given its age, it's an act that's based on an analogue model when we're in a digital paradigm. And those challenges will, of course, increase as we're seeing the net move from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0. And in the future, it'll be the metaverse. More broadly, Internal Affairs Te Tari continues to work really closely with the community, as well as with international partners, to really deepen our understanding of why violent extremist content is created and what compels people to share it online. And we are commissioning research with partners to try and help us build that stable of knowledge. Moving to our panellists, I'm honoured to have the panel joining me today. We've got a mix of researchers, community members and public servants. They're all working in the same space that we are. So the format will be that each person will have 7 minutes to speak or present, and then there'll be time for questions and panel discussion. We're asking speakers to keep 7 minutes because I understand that yesterday some of the speakers talked for longer and there wasn't enough time for questions from the floor. Also, learning from yesterday, there will be a mix of people able to ask questions from the floor, and people who wish to use the app will accept questions using the app as well. And I'll be assisted in managing the flow of questions by my colleague Nicole, who is sitting at the front here. So now I'll introduce the panel, and they're seated in the order that they will speak. So firstly, we have Dr. Chris Wilson. Chris is a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. He undertakes research into and teaching on political violence and is the program director of the Master of Conflict and Terrorism Studies. His most recently published work includes investigations into far-right groups, white genocide and misogyny. Chris is also the director of Hate and Extremism Insights Aotearoa, which is also based at Auckland University. Hate and Extremism Insights Aotearoa conducts data-led research to measure and analyse harmful online rhetoric, providing a contextualised understanding of the online violent extremism landscape in our country. And certainly from Te Tari's perspective, we're very interested in Chris's work. Secondly, we have Dr. Mazharuddin Syed Ahmed, who I understand is known as Massey, who is a senior instructor at the Department of Engineering and Architectural Studies at the Art Institute in Christchurch. Massey holds a PhD in engineering education and a Master of Science in Architectural Engineering. Massey won the People's Choice Award for the Best Postgraduate Research at the University of Canterbury in 2016. He's also received awards for teaching and research excellence. Massey is a survivor of the Christchurch Mosque attacks, and we acknowledge that. He's a member of the Christchurch Call Network and is a board member of the Collective Impact Board, which provides ongoing wraparound services to the affected whānau, survivors and witnesses of those attacks in 2019. Then we have Ash Johnston, who is a late substitute for Christina Kirk from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So I jokingly asked him if he was called Christina this morning. Ash is a career intelligence professional with 35 years' experience in operational policy and management roles relating to national security issues. He's currently working for New Zealand Police, where he's the director of the National Threat Management System. He's also the business lead for the cross-agency response to Recommendation 12 of the Christchurch Royal Commission report, which is to develop and promote an accessible reporting system. Ash has got a real passion for understanding the impact of mis and disinformation and conspiratorial thinking on the threatscape, including its impact on social cohesion. Finally, at the end, we have Nick Law, who's one of my colleagues. Nick is a policy manager in the Department of Internal Affairs. Nick is here because he's leading the Content Regulatory Review, which in part is reviewing the Classification Act. And that review aims to reduce the risk of exposure to unsafe online and media content that could cause harm. Nick's got policy experience across a wide range of regulatory systems and legislation, and his team's recent work includes policy advice on the Keep It Real Online campaign, law changes for rapid assessment and takedown of illegal content online, and improvements to warnings and ratings for commercial video on demand. The floor is yours, Chris.
Morena, as if there wasn't enough pressure speaking to such a distinguished audience. There's a giant clock down there counting me down, and it appears that we're running a little bit short of time. So because I'm an academic and I think everything I have to say is very important, what I'm going to do is speak faster than I initially planned rather than cut anything out. So please bear with me. Hopefully that's... As we all know, the levels of online violent extremism are at unprecedented levels. And this is true in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, just as much as it is overseas. Lockdown increased the time that people spend online. It increased frustration and anger. And this led to rising levels of extremism. But this was true, these trends were evident even before COVID came along. There was increased polarisation, the rise of far-right populist leaders around the world who were increasingly willing to glorify violence and glorify hate and online. We have a paradox as researchers and also as government agencies that the vast majority of those who engage in this type of online extremist rhetoric don't go on to engage in violent acts offline. However, the small number of people who do increasingly are radicalised almost entirely online. Now, of course, these increasing levels of online extremism also lead to a broader range of harms to those people who are exposed to their vitriol and hate online. So, what can we do about this? What's happening online is clearly important, but at the same time, there seems an increasing and almost unmanageable level of data out there to be able to really get a grasp on what are the most important trends, what sort of posts should we look at, what trends should we follow, which are the most dangerous ideas and movements, how can we find, in the New Zealand context, how can we find the true threats to Māori and other minorities in the country from this giant sea of data. This goal is perhaps the most important in the study of violent extremism and the response to violent extremism. And until now, it's been very difficult to find the red flags that point to these type of real threats. Government agencies can't do much because they don't have the resources and they don't have the time to be able to adequately monitor with any type of accuracy that we can completely rely on this level of data. And the same for researchers, and government agencies also don't have the social licence for mass surveillance. It's the same for researchers. We've been unable to identify these type of red flags because there's just too much information out there. Hate and Extremism Insights Aotearoa, or Hillyer, at the University of Auckland, we're working to develop a way of meeting this challenge. We're collecting millions of posts by New Zealand-based posters. We're being very careful that these are New Zealand-based posters. And we're collecting them from the most dangerous platforms, including 4chan, Reddit, Telegram, and so on. We're not collecting any personal identifying data or information. As researchers, we're interested in and we're focused on trends, not individuals. We use a range of natural language tools to assess the emotion behind the posts. More specifically, how much negative emotion and toxicity is indicated by the words used in the post as a whole. We're therefore measuring the negative emotions such as anger, sadness, frustration, isolation, loneliness, felt by the writer who wrote the post, and also things that other readers would find appalling if they came across those posts online. We're therefore detecting the emotions that, one, push people along the path to radicalisation, and two, the language that causes online harms to others. We've been able to identify a smaller subset of posts which is, one, both more manageable for researchers and agencies to follow and analyse, and two, is the most concerning and dangerous subset of extremism-related online posting. Now I'm going to start off with a few graphs, and then I'm going to come to a few insights and conclusions that we drew from our study, which was of online extremism in the first 6 months of 2022. The The first step we took was to divide into three main forms of extremism, extremist rhetoric online. These are obviously not the only forms of extremism, but these are the ones we focused on. Conspiracy theory related, misogyny related, and far right related extremism. We identified keywords that made sure that these were separate. We were able to treat them as mutually exclusive, if you like. And I know there are a number of issues with that, and I've been very vocal myself in terms of trying to work out the relationship between these ideologies. But we can come to that in the discussion. This is the first graph that you can see shows the top line, by far the most numerous conspiracy theory related posts in green. Lower and a smaller number, you can see that there was a large spike around late February and early March, unsurprisingly around the time of the protests in Wellington. The blue line of a much smaller number is far right related posts, and then a smaller number again is misogyny related posts. As you can see from the previous graph as well, conspiracy theory related posts are by far the most numerous, but also the less consistent over time, over the study period, and did drop off after that spike. Now, if we look at the proportion of posts from all three ideologies that demonstrate what we categorised as concerning levels of negative emotion, the negative emotions that I mentioned before, and also toxicity. We did this, we set this threshold through a qualitative examination of a subset of posts to be able to identify what is a level that we would consider to be very concerning. I'm in the red, so I'm going to try and move through reasonably quickly. The next slide does the same thing for conspiracy theory related posts. As you can see, again, the total number of posts at the top, a very large spike around February and March. The proportion in green, which shows the proportion that show those negative levels of emotion, is small, but not inconsequential. And the level of toxicity within conspiracy theory related posts is also much lower. When it comes to far-right extremism related posts, the numbers are much smaller, but the proportion of negative emotion is far higher. I'll come back to this in my final slide. Again, the levels of toxicity are lower. When we come to misogyny-related extremism, the numbers are again smaller, but as I'll point to in the final slide, which I'm going to jump to in a second, the levels of toxicity are by far the highest when it comes to misogyny-related posts. These are a number of insights that we drew out of this study. So we identified a smaller subset of posts that we can classify as highly negative or toxic. We hypothesise, or I hypothesise, given I'm the one here to face the music, that these posts indicate a higher level of engagement with extremist ideas, to a higher level of emotion on the part of the posters involved, and therefore a greater risk of violent action. Second, the three extremist ideologies peak and trough at different times, indicating that they are responding to different events and developments, both within New Zealand and overseas, which again is an interesting finding because of this convergence that I was talking about before and this mix between the ideologies. Conspiracy theory-related posts were the most numerous, followed by far-right and misogyny-related posts. However, far-right posts demonstrated the highest levels of negative emotion, and misogyny posts demonstrated the highest levels of toxicity. There were fewer posters on fringe platforms like 4chan, but they are the most active and negative than ones on more mainstream platforms such as Telegram and Reddit. And there has been a large drop-off in extremist rhetoric, largely driven by a decline in conspiracy theory-related discourse. But the volume of far-right and misogynistic extremism has remained far more consistent over the period of our study. My starting point was that the current volume of extremist rhetoric is too high for researchers and government agencies to be able to identify which are the most concerning trends and topics within extremism in New Zealand. We've responded to this perhaps with a New Zealand first, and don't quote me on this, but potentially a global first in terms of being able to identify the emotion of the poster who wrote the post itself, and therefore we're able to identify which are the most dangerous trends, which minorities are most likely to be targeted and when, and changes in that rhetoric, and therefore which are the aspects of society and Aotearoa that we should focus most closely on to strengthen. Thank you.
Kia ora, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great privilege and honor for me to present here, and thank you very much. And I would like to acknowledge Brother Abdul Razak's support for this research. Without his support, I wouldn't have been here. Today's presentation is all about information weaponization. I can't speak more that Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has emphasized at least 8 times in her speech. So this really speaks volumes about the importance of this area. So today I'm just trying to present the awareness and the importance and, of course, what we are doing around this work. So my work is around understanding the hate, the discrimination, the bias in our media, more so in social media. So my idea is to combine the index, which will give us some indicator coming from the social media, news media, and of course the hate incidents report. Combining, we might have a very simplistic idea about what, because hate and hate speech or discrimination or bias online or offline is very dynamic. It's evolving, it's very subjective. So this framework is not only for a particular community or Islamophobia, but this is in general to all other evolving paradigms of hate in Aotearoa. So if we are reminded by persistent threat, and one of the most important connecting dots about that is that social media or the print media or digital media plays a very big role. So there's a constant news and reminders around this topic. So social media and online is one of the key, and we need to really understand what role it is playing. Of course, the Royal Commission of Hate has put a special emphasis on, so we need a lot of empirical evidence. We need a lot of data. We need a lot of analytics. We need a lot of research to support and understand in what areas and paradigms we need to focus. To see this horizon or the spectrum of the web or the social media, what we see as a surface media, or we browse on internet using our browsers or our mobile phones or social media using our social media platforms, is barely we touch around 10 to 15% of the data. And the rest is all hidden, which is very popularly known as deep web and dark web. This really requires very sophisticated research, algorithms, and other artificial intelligence. And it's also longitudinal. You need to really have a research of at least 5 to 8 years before you can really understand what's going on in the whole depth and width of this area. We all know that the surface, deep, and the digital media is in a different modality. The ambassadors and the partnerships and the content coming up, own versus paid versus earn, and the social media. So what I'm looking at is the very niche areas of social media, more so towards Twitter and other websites. So to do that, we need to really understand what are these social media platforms. They're nothing but basically the town criers. Town criers, if you see in the history, they represent somebody, they read whatever they've been given, and their role is to reach as many people as they can. So if you see, Twitter is now, the Twitter's role is now as a search engine. So if you want to know latest what is going on about this event, you better search on Twitter rather than going to Google, because Google is not going to give you anything about what's happened, because I'm sure many of you have already tweeted, shared on social media. So Twitter is one place where it is now a search engine to know the latest news and breaking news. So Twitter is now one of the primary tools to break the news, and you can see right from the others. And then whatever said and proliferated on Twitter becomes the sentiment in all other medias they carry. Then, of course, Twitter is now becoming such a big power that now there is a term coming out, it's called diplomacy. It's about that the people and all the political leaders or the celebrities or the influencers, they use a lot of their influence or using Twitters. And just recently, Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, and you can understand that how powerful this tool is and around. And Twitter is also now a fundamental part of where whatever happens on tweet, whatever is being swamped or trended in Twitter becomes the mainstream news. So that's really dictating. Twitter is dictating a lot of media, what goes on both digital and print media as well. So let us see what are their algorithms that basically are. This is coming right from the horse's mouth. Twitter has accepted that their tweets sometimes amplify right-wing political content. And if more so, the Facebook itself, and if you know that this whistleblower has created a huge front page where Facebook's algorithms bias were highlighted, and then Facebook had to really go down to the drawing board and redesign about their biases. YouTube, again, MIT's technologies research says there are a lot of their fun alt-right-wing. So what do we do about all this bias? We have a lot of biases, and we need to understand those biases, and that's the fundamental part of my work. So biases, if unchecked, this is an ADL, Anti-Defamation League's very famous hate pyramid. If biases don't get unchecked, they can take a shape of prejudice and go into the acts of discrimination and eventually end up in genocide. We have seen this, what happened in the US during the Trump's era. So this is a very, very important, sensitive area that we need to work on understanding the bias coming in from the social media, print media, digital media, and other medias. Because in New Zealand, we live in the 2 degrees of separation. Anything goes on in New Zealand could be very fast than any other country all over the world. So this is a very, very important area. So to do this mining, when you have humongous veracity, volume, data coming in, we need very advanced technologies, advanced artificial intelligences, algorithms that take us from the data information source to insights, knowledge, and create wisdom so that we have data-driven results. Of course, there are a lot of media organizations all over the world which monitor. We need such in New Zealand because we need to develop a lot of laws and regulations which we have a huge gap to fill in our in hate legislations. So this research, first of all, fundamentally mines the data from both coming from social media and digital media. And to do so, we have mined the most important trending hashtags after March 15th, and to see what was so this is a corpus dashboard, live dashboard, but unfortunately I cannot show you live over here today, but you can really go drill down and understand where the tweets and what sentiments and what the veracity of sentiment were coming up. To give you a small insight, we did analysis about the movie which was produced on March 15 victims, and we did the sentiment analysis and see the tweet trending map coming in support of that, both in New Zealand and the networks evolving around that. Finally, the hate monitoring report also looks at the digital news media, because digital news media is a very, let's say, formal and articulate content. So we try to compare between the news represented for Muslim community and the other Christian community, and it was a very clear bias around the way it was represented. Again, the news coming out of the various other terrorist incidents, the Nashville bombing or the Christchurch terror attack, there was a clear bias in representing the way the terminologies were used. Finally, I think that we need to really rethink and redesign and restructure the research going around this topic, that we are better informed and our data is rich to support and identify the hate and biases coming out of the topic. I thank you for your time and listening. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou katoa. I didn't have time to prepare any slides. Yay. Because I've got you to interact with, so I'm going to take some time to do that. And I'm just conscious that we are imparting a lot of information as a panel and a lot of content in a short period of time, which can be a little bit overwhelming and a little bit sort of like a tidal wave coming towards you. So I'm actually going to slow things down a bit and ignore most of my prepared notes, rot-row, and freewheel some stuff. But first of all, can I have a quick show of hands around the room if you feel that more than ever before there is more hurtful information online today? More hurtful information. Pretty much everyone in the room. Okay. What about more harmful information? Slight difference. Still pretty much everyone. What about more dangerous information? Okay, excellent. We are in the right place then. I just want to take some time to think about what it is that we're confronted with and the difference between the online space and the offline space. In the real world, if there is still such a distinction, we are concerned on a daily basis with really serious threat information that gets managed through some proper systems. The most significant issues are always the ones that attract the priority response. And when we're talking about physical violence and obviously personal harm, then therefore it is right that that's the case. But I get a sense that there is so much harm going on in the online world that doesn't quite make it through the thresholds of the system to receive sort of a prioritised response. Does that sound generally like your experience, from your lived experience? Yes. So what is it that the system can do to try and bridge that gap between what's happening online and what's happening in the real world? I'm really here today representing the recommendation 12 from the RCOI response system or process. It's a cross-agency initiative to meet the RCOI recommendation, where we are focusing on the scope of issues that cause us harm, the scale at which that happens, and how, as a system, we can do more and do better to fill that gap. One of the key things for us, I guess, is to realise, and it's been the theme throughout the whole of the last couple of days, and it's something my wife says all the time, that we are better together. This is something that we have to confront and succeed with together because the issue is so important to us. I told you I was skipping over most of the notes. I'll just pause for a second though. Twitter being the most prominent source of breaking news. I think that's quite astounding because I often wonder what it is, what's the common ground in our society? Where do we get our news information from? And if I was asked to ask for a quick show of hands, on any given day, who probably gets their primary source of news from like mainstream media? TVNZ, TV3, newspapers. Something where content is delivered to you across a range of things. And you don't necessarily choose that content personally, but it's delivered to you. Then what about, thinking of newspapers, what about going behind the paywall? Anyone subscribe to premium services? Wow, you guys are real special. I wonder what sort of news you're getting. And I wonder what I'm missing out on. Okay, what about social media? Obviously the big stuff and other platforms. International platforms, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. I won't ask you to put your hand up if it's Fox News. I do have Fox News as an app on my phone, by the way. Where do you think your kids get their news from? You've already had a bit of a hint here. TikTok, exactly, right? So, just within this room alone, there are various responses about where you get your primary source of information. They all have a different slant, a different take on it, so that just makes me think, what is it that creates a common bond for us as a society where we all understand something through the same lens? Question just to leave you to ponder on that, because I think it has quite significant impacts for how we as a society understand our issues together. Just turning now to the Royal Commission of Inquiry Recommendation 12. To create a public reporting mechanism that makes it safe and accessible for members of the public to report concerning incidents and behaviours to government. The RCOI recognised that this was a significant gap in the system. I would say that there are BAU processes which already exist to manage the material that is reported, but it's certainly an area that requires some strengthening and a deeper understanding because of the changing situations and context in which we are working. The RCOI also pointed out that it's a myth that the intelligence and law enforcement agencies knew everything and monitor everything. We also heard that reflected again as well. We do not and cannot monitor the internet, and that certainly remains the case, where much of the information that sits in the online domain is visible to you as members of the public or as parts of various groups, but it may not be visible to the threat management system. Therefore, we need to deliver a reporting mechanism that can capture the power of the information that you are seeing, the concerns that you identify, and bring that into the centre so that it can be appropriately assessed and managed. In partnership with recommendation 12 is 13, know the signs. We talked about that yesterday. That creates an environment for what is really significant and important to look out for. But I would really like recommendation 12 in our reporting mechanism to be more than a vigilance type approach of a system, but also to be an opportunity for individuals to raise a concern or share a concern, perhaps about a loved one who has been radicalised and gone down the rabbit hole. We've heard from some preliminary engagement with communities that recommendation 12 should be a uniquely New Zealand approach and uniquely New Zealand system that's culturally and religiously competent, that's obviously easy to use, not a punitive-based approach. And the expectations are very high, understandably. We have a lot of work to do in a short period of time, but we firmly believe that we have a critically important mission to achieve and one that can make a real difference. I would just say in closing that in August this year, Cabinet approved funding for the project to be formally stood up on a full-time basis, and we have a full-time project team that is working on a business case to report back to Cabinet in May next year on how we are going to do this. That's part of the journey, but it will keep going beyond that in terms of how we build and deliver that service. And that relies heavily, if not exclusively, on input from you as community members, from community groups, and interested individuals. So I would just issue a plea that if you have a particular interest in this piece of work, please reach out on the app using my email. Very happy to come and have a chat and talk about any things in that realm. I think we may not achieve everything all in one go, but in the words of one of our audience members, hopefully Brother Iglak is in the audience today, our ambition should be to think big, start small, but scale fast. As I think you'll agree, there's a lot riding on this. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou i ngā uhuatanga o te wā, ko Nick Law toku ingoa, ke te taritai whenua e mahi ana, ko kai whakahaere, kai papahere, tuku tūranga mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, I'm Nick from the Department of Internal Affairs, and I've got a slot here today because my team is thinking about how we transform our tired and fragmented content regulatory system that Marilyn was referring to, and we call this work the Content Regulatory Review. Marilyn also mentioned that the building blocks of our content regulatory system are primarily based around these kind of physical concepts of media and professionally curated media. And the basis of them are the Classification Act and the Broadcasting Act, but we also have some self-regulatory bodies in the mix as well. And these have had some updates over time, but there's no doubt that they were not set up for user-generated, high-speed, high-volume content. It's far beyond what was ever contemplated. And this is why it's necessary for us now to transform our regulatory system so that it provides safeguards across all forms of content, regardless of whether it's professionally edited and curated or it's created by users. In my time today, I want to touch on two areas of our work to review the content regulatory system. First, I would like to give you an idea of what is driving our work to bring about effective regulatory change, essentially a sense of what is falling through the regulatory gaps at the moment. And then secondly, I'll briefly outline where other countries that are more advanced in this area are heading. Fairly recently, I think it was in June 2022, the Classification Office issued a report where the respondents told us that 83% felt that they were concerned about harmful or inappropriate content in social media, video sharing sites or other websites. I think I saw Henry from the Classification Office, the researcher at the back of the room. And at our outset, our review was really focused on understanding the scale and severity of harmful experiences caused by content across all forms of media. So a fitting starting point for us was to pull together a picture of what those experiences looked like, what our fears and the threats we are facing, and we also set out to understand what our hopes are for change in the regulatory system. Which one is it? That one. Thank you. Oh, this one. We began our first phase of engagement for the content regulatory review in late 2021. And during that engagement, we heard from regulators, government agencies, NGOs, media organisations. But most of our time was spent with groups representing communities and identity groups, including Māori, ethnic and faith-based, LGBTQI, seniors, women, disabled and Pacific communities. Our engagement showed our regulatory system wasn't adapting fast enough to deal with the new and evolving technologies and the content that's on them. Along with these new and emerging technologies, we also came to understand that we are changing. Our context is changing, and our societal values, norms, and increasing diversity within Aotearoa have made the outdated nature of our existing system even more apparent. This confirmed that we are going to need to find a way to build in a tremendous amount of flexibility, because every aspect of the system is constantly changing. We heard some harrowing stories of how communities are being harmed by some content and conduct on social media in particular. A couple of areas that really stood out in just about every session was the spread of mis and disinformation, bullying and harassment of individuals and communities online, and the way that this leads to amplifying existing social divisions. In just about every one of our 50-plus sessions, there was significant concern for children as an at-risk group and targets for harmful content. There were a lot of comments about lack of targeted, accessible and coordinated education and awareness initiatives to increase media literacy and resilience to harmful content. Participants were suggesting to us that this focus on education and awareness initiatives would go a long way to fostering and promoting healthier media environments in Aotearoa. At the other end of the spectrum, we also heard widespread acknowledgement for the need for government intervention when it comes to the most harmful content on the internet. That extreme end of harm spectrum, content that falls into that category we refer to as objectionable, and that's the term that we use for illegal content in New Zealand. And this covers things like promotion of terrorism and child sexual exploitation and abuse material. But below that threshold of illegal, where content is legal but still potentially harmful, this is where our conversations got much more complicated in deciding when and how to respond to unsafe content. It's in this space of legal but harmful content that we heard the greatest concern for many groups around guarding for protection of freedom of expression that we enjoy in Aotearoa. The need to preserve freedom of expression came through as a fundamental principle for the entire review. Okay, now let's turn and look a little bit at what's happening with the international landscape. I often hear people question, what impact can New Zealand have on this issue? Much of today's content, of course, has few, if any, borders, and it's increasingly disaggregated, and these are huge companies that we're talking about. A large part of the answer is in international alignment. International collaboration needs to be baked in from the outset to any new system that deals with these global platforms. Given the importance of international alignment, we have been following closely the work of other countries in this area. And we're particularly interested in code-based approaches that place minimum expectations on media service providers, and we've seen some of those coming through from the UK, Australia and Ireland. Codes are a flexible tool. They can adapt with changing technologies, threats and expectations, and they are also already a familiar part of our content regulatory landscape in the broadcasting system. Another area of interest is the EU's recently established Digital Safety Act. And in particular, I'm going to call out the Act's emphasis on platform transparency. This includes a requirement for media platforms to provide transparency reporting on the nature of harms on their platforms, the scale of these harms, and the steps that they are taking to address the risk that they pose. And transparency is really important in a system that's based around informed consumer choice. In the space of education, and I think we've heard a bit about that over the last couple of days, Finland and Estonia have provided great examples of how critical thinking can be woven into the education system to build stronger, longer-term resilience to a broad array of harmful content. And that resilience is really important in a landscape of changing threats. There's a clear international trend towards increasing oversight of online content, and we're seeing this particularly coming together with regulatory relationships that include the industry doing it together. There's also a really strong theme internationally around protecting children and young people, as well as historically targeted communities. And it's interesting that many of these international trends align with a lot of what we heard from our community groups. Ultimately, with this work, we are trying to create the conditions for a safer online media content environment. Its creators, users, platforms, government, educators and caregivers, and civil society all playing their part in the system. And sometimes this can feel like an impossible task for a small country, but we have shown we have influence and impact beyond our size in this area. We're continuing to develop and draft proposals for change, and we will continue to test these ideas with communities, experts and industry. I'm really hopeful that shortly we will be in a position to be able to share some of our work more widely and move into another phase of workshopping. I'd also like to sort of issue the same request as Ash. If you're interested in this work, I'd love to speak to you over the remainder of the hui, or please do get in touch. Ngā mihi, kia ora koutou.
Well done, panel. It's 3 minutes past 11. We have almost half an hour for questions, and I have a first question, which is from the app. It's general to the panel, but we might ask Ash to kick off with the response. So the question is, internationally, many countries are experiencing and struggling with how to manage violent extremist content through online gaming. They're treated differently to social media. How should we manage the problem? I'm not quite sure whether they thought that you would be the right person to start with, Ash, but have a go.
I think there is a significant area of research that still needs to take place, or at least for us to understand the implications of online gaming and the violence that glorifies in some ways and perpetuates, that maybe we haven't really sort of fully understood the implications yet. I look to my colleagues and also to He Whenua Taurakura for research initiatives in this space. So beyond that, do I think it has an impact? Yes, I think it does. It softens our sensitivity to graphic extreme violence, and that never really has a soft edge for the rest of society. So,
yeah.
Others may.
Chris, is it something that you've encountered?
I know The extent of my knowledge of video games goes as far as Donkey Kong in the 1980s, so I'm probably not the person to comment on, but I think it's a fantastic question, and it's a topic that is probably of just as much importance in the related to pathways of radicalisation as social media, so I would agree.
Nick looks like he wants to say something.
I think one aspect of the gaming side of things that sometimes we don't appreciate, especially if you're not a gamer, is the social element of it. And actually, through games, there's a huge element of connection that people have. They'll have friends over the world, they'll build all around the world, and they will build significant networks, and they'll communicate through that platform just like they use many other communication tools in their lives. And so they become a huge way that they share all sorts of aspects, and that would include extremist material as well. But from the perspective of the system, I mean, the way that we are thinking about it is essentially this is content, and the regulatory system should be able to deal with it, and it is not distinct from anything else. But I think the gaming side of it, I think the more interesting element is that it is really a network tool.
Yeah, my take on gaming is that because they target a lot of young minds, you know, teenagers, and they're found to be one of the most addictive online content, because now they not only create teams, but they have collaborated with very anonymous people on gaming platforms. But the fact that the US data on a lot of gun violence has a correlation to the gaming, because the familiarity of weapons, the availability of weapons, and the destruction and the damage they can do. Kids at that age know, I mean, you know, what each gun can do, and the familiarity with using that weapon. And they're getting more bloodier, they're getting more violent in the way they engage our kids. So with all this data, I think that is one of the biggest influencer in today's.
Marilyn, if I could just add a comment, because Nick's just raised something that tweaked my interest, and that's around what is community to you. So if you are online and mixing with a community from all around the world, that's your kind of neighbourhood, more so than the physical neighbourhood that you live in. So you're more likely to know people on other parts of the world that have different perspectives on a whole range of things, different influences playing out into their lives than your common neighbourhood within Aotearoa.
Do we have any questions from the floor? We have a question at the front. Okay, we have a question over here as well.
We have a spare one.
It's very hard to see because of the lights. Okay.
Kia ora. It was really good to hear Nick say that New Zealand has influence beyond our size overseas. That's fantastic. But laws like Section 230 in the US and other similar laws and regulations overseas make it easy for the platforms to avoid the consequences of the content that they host. So my question is really, what can we do here from Aotearoa to help hold the platforms accountable for the harm for the harm caused by the content that they host and promote?
Yes, those that are domiciled in the US are challenging because of Section 230, and I completely understand that issue. I think this is why international alignment is incredibly important. So our regulators here already work significantly to carry out investigations internationally with our partners, and partly that's because we are dependent on what their domestic laws are to help us achieve the same sort of safety outcomes as well. But a future regulatory system needs to be one where we have greater alignment both in the regulatory system and the way that the regulators work to get better outcomes for the global community. We can, however, put on that a domestic lens, so what's important to us with our values. And I think what we see with the industry is that some of them are really willing to participate within a regulatory system. They just want us to tell them what the parameters are. There's another part which obviously will not participate. They will be proudly not participate in a regulatory system. But if we put a lot of our focus on that big chunk, then we can protect a huge portion of our population. And I think that is where a lot of our effort needs to go. And I think there's a lot of willingness from platforms to work with us on that.
I've got a question over here from Abdul Razak, who's next.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdul Razak from the Federation of Islamic Association. I wasn't funding Mazhar, our federation is funding Fazar. And this actually directly relates to something that the Prime Minister raised and earlier. The Royal Commission talked in terms of all of society and all of government approach. And this makes New Zealand unique compared to many other countries. And all of society, I mean, us as the Muslim community, we were impacted. We had the Christchurch call. We have the DIA doing amazing work, DPMC, SIS, police, and others doing 105, doing work. We as a society or as community, the flax root, as our brothers called it yesterday, have an absolute duty. So in this respect, one of the things we have urged the government, and the government is listening, and I heard today, is that unless you fund us, we can't do it. The work that Mazhar and the Federation is doing is actually paid dividends. We've actually identified, we've left 105 no, in case one was actually arrested. So we will work together, but we need that support and funding. And that includes the police and others. And I know we have a lot of talk with Ash and others. It's all related to not just political will. We know we have the political will. It's the funding which will allow us to address this. So I make this plea with the Prime Minister being here to be aware of it, the community to be funded. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question over here.
Thank you. Well, it's a kind of question, but also it's a kind of a reality check. Newly we did through the Learning Community Hub, which a Minister of Education project, we did something called Parenting and Technology, which talks basically around this. We're teaching the parents about, what's happening online and how they do parenting and with the uncertainty of what's happening, and especially about the gaming. The problem you have either parents who know everything and parents who doesn't know even to know how to use the phones and know how to speak English. So you have a wide gap between both. And you have a Minister of Education who doesn't know how to apply the hybrid education that actually came up during the COVID-19. So there was a major gap of people with a misadvantage. Why I'm talking about this, there was a problem about this, like, Ustaz Abdul Razak said. But my talking about here, the gaming was a major problem because it opened about the trauma after March 15. Many of the people, they, especially the teenagers, the children of the impacted families, they went through the gaming, the online, and especially the videos that were posted and the people opinionated about what happened. They were completely being traumatized over time. We can see it through the gaming until this moment. There's nothing to protect even the people who go in the chat rooms in the gaming. And we see women are being blackmailed with their photos, and no one telling them that they can come forward and where to go, anonymous. And some of them come from ethnic backgrounds. There's no system in the ground to protect them, especially with the cultural or religious backgrounds. When you try to front up to the government and ask them, where is the system? They say it's in the individual prevention or individual cases. But the problem, when you say individual cases, it means it depends on the person's skills or their own background. And the problem, each person comes from a different culture. And sometimes they see you not as a human, they see you just as a person. And it depends how much resources they want to give you. And that's a big problem that's happening in different communities, not only in Muslim community. So my question, especially I think to Mazharuddin, nice to meet you. I always hear about you, and I know in the previous year you were doing a lot of work with us. But I know you were very trying to advocate with the whole online content and how to advocate. But I think it's a more of awareness and advocacy, but also knowledge. But it's a knowledge across culture and across ministries and having a system, which is we lack. And the problem we have, the Christchurch call, we have like so many fancy names of frameworks we heard about in this conference, but the problem, no one is talking to each other. And yesterday, even Abdulrazak, he said, you even contradict each other. Like even when you were speaking now, I don't think any one of you sat with each other before this session. Just say if I'm wrong. And that's a major problem. That talks about our situation now. No one is talking to each other. And if we don't listen to each other, we're going really, really, really in a bad days. Hopefully, my question yesterday in the dinner, someone asked me, what's your biggest scare as a community? I was like, it's not about Muslim community. It's the question. I think Prime Minister said the threat now is like, who's next and when? And how can we prevent that? It's more about that. So it's a more of a holistic question. I think it's a more of a comment with suggestion, with a policy, I think it's a long way to go. But my question now, in this framework, the digital, the content, like we are the only people in the whole world that we were streamed being killed. I saw my friend being killed online while I was in the hospital, less than a kilometer away. They're being shot, And I was like, is that really happening? Never happened, even a war being live streamed. And I was like, until this moment, in 3 years down the street, no one is standing there telling me, this is the system. Solidly. They're still coming and asking us to put their comments online and not fronting up, with all respect. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for that, Partai. And I'm really sorry that that's been your experience. We have a real forward focus on systemic change. So some of what you were talking about is, I think, how you move the system to something that takes so much of the risk out in the first place, so you're never faced with those issues. And that is a lot of what the Content Regulatory Review is essentially about, is trying to make people's experience online safer. And whether that is making more tools available to them to make themselves safer, or platforms taking more steps to keep people safer. But that is a really big part about it, is shifting from a reactive system into something that proactively makes people safer. I think Massey wanted to say something.
Thank you, Mr. for your kind words. I can't talk more about the emphasis you've just created. I mean, I think if you look at the fact that people who have seen the video of the shooter, everybody thought that it was like a video game, right? Nobody believed it at first place. So that it still speaks volumes, right? Like how much of that he was inspired, he was into gaming, and the way he created the whole, the whole scene about broadcasting it, the way he had the gear on himself, the camera, and the whole scenario was like a game. But that's exactly what I'm trying to emphasize here, that we really don't understand what are the differentiators or disruptors in this area, right? So I think this is very important. Along with the gun laws, we really need that net safe organization to really take into it, dive deep into it, because a lot of our teenagers are spending more time on gaming than any other social media, and that's very, very violent. And very recently, just last week, Rebecca had, NZSIS had just emphasized about that how teenagers are slurring or using violent terrorist content as a joke.
Okay. We've got some questions beginning to back up now. I've got a question from the app.
Oh, wait.
No, hold on. I've got a question from the app, and then I've got Pushpa Wood, and then we can come to you. So the question from the app is for the entire panel. Are there any youth involved in any of your agencies at a governance level?
It's a
a bit too early for us, for Rec 12. We've had one governance meeting, and the governance board is considering what the diversity and the representation should be. So it's still an open question for recommendation 12.
We had a significant youth component to our initial engagement, and that was actually run by a separate agency to support that. So we weren't directly involved with it, actually. It was essentially youth-led. And the next phase of our work will hopefully be to think about what governance for the regulatory system looks like, and I expect we would do something similar again.
No one else wants to comment? So Pushpa Ward doesn't appear to have a microphone. So we'll go to you if you have a microphone.
Kia ora. As a token young person that uses social media, I have a few questions that relate to social media. So some of the things that we noticed in the presentation that weren't mentioned were social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, which are the platforms that are most used by young people. And we saw recently, within the last few months even, cases where Andrew Tate, Kanye's anti-Semitic remarks, went viral, and a lot of young people were involved or impacted or exposed to the dangerous viral content that went online and promoted through those platforms, and was spread before anything was done about it. So what's being done to monitor TikTok and Instagram trends that are moving at a really fast pace, and how are you keeping on top of those viral trends, especially if you're not constantly engaged with social media platforms and you're facing content that is becoming irrelevant every 1 week? I think if we're still kind of debating, organisations are debating whether or not they should use TikTok for youth engagement, and it's been 3 years since it's been started. We've got to start considering whether it's still relevant, and what other forms we can use to engage young people, and whether it's worth having more young people at the decision-making level who are more involved, more engaged, and able to kind of, have that understanding of what's going on in that landscape for young people who are facing these risks every day. Kia ora.
Just very briefly, I'll just say that that's just a fantastic question and comment, and it's not that we don't, in terms of my research, that we don't recognise the importance of TikTok and Instagram. It's more of a technological problem in terms of being able to pick up image-based technologies as opposed to text-based technologies, where there's a lot more work and technology behind it. But it's certainly, that's just, you touch on a point that is right at the heart of where, the things that we need to be looking at the moment. So I completely agree.
Yeah. Thank you for that lovely question. I think it's very important that we do have to recognize the influence of TikTok or Snapchat and all the evolving social media. But the fact that Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have academic data wrangling accounts, we can access that data through academic accounts, or you can curate millions of tweets and other YouTube content. That makes the research more, easier to do than other tools. So I'm not sure, because I'm a newbie in this area. I've just started this research 3 years back, and hopefully, thank you for emphasizing that. I think there should be future research going on in that.
If you see something on TikTok that concerns you, what's your approach now? What do you think you might do to report that? Anything? Not know who to report it to? Bit tricky, huh? So that's one of the things, the bridges that we have to cross, where people being the largest sort of eyes and ears that are available to us to collect information that's of potential concern. How can they get that message into somewhere that can look at that, make an assessment about what actions can be taken on that?
I'm going to ask Nick not to answer that question because we've got time for 2 final questions. The Prime Minister's delivered a microphone to Pushpa, And then I have one final question from a woman sitting right in the centre. Pushpa's very embarrassed, but please, Pushpa, you've
It
been
is
waiting.
embarrassing. The idea of giving the question to you was so you could ask there to save time. My question is, are we as a country prepared to identify the content which is now coming through in different languages? And that's where our biggest risk is at the moment. The content, the objectionable content is not necessarily all coming in English. That is my question.
Which one of you wants to take that?
You've stumped us.
I can just answer no. We're not. It would be from my. I would just say no, and to keep it very brief. I don't think we are, and I think that's a great question and suggestion, and it's something we need to work on.
Nick?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. No, Massa, you go.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky because if you look in Twitter, Facebook, I mean, a lot of that content addressed for New Zealand context or New Zealand related news is you can only wrangle it or understand it because if it is addressed or hashtagged or if there is a point. And of course, because a lot of users don't mention their location and where they're coming from, that makes it very difficult. But yeah, that's a great area in most of the research.
Right, we've got 4 minutes, chaps.
I was just going to echo that. I know I saw Caroline, our chief censor, in my eye line over there, and I know that this is a real challenge for our regulatory bodies. It's a real resourcing challenge to support the translation that is required to understand both the context and the words involved with those sentiments.
Okay. My friend, I don't know your name, but you have the final question.
My name is Ramat. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the speaker. My question will address one of the key points that was raised by Nick when you show us that slide about the strategies that have been adopted by other countries like the UK. I saw something quite interesting with the one for, I think, UK and other places, something about code calling or another thing about critical thinking and other. I'm just thinking these are good frameworks that have been set up by them to guide some of these abusive or untrustworthy content online. There are things that New Zealand, in our own media landscape space, we could look into, but it's something we could look beyond. Let's look, for instance, there are some people touting different ideas. We tag them conspiracy ideas about different things. And they get those information from social media content. How do you think people are well equipped to be able to discern if a content is trustworthy or not? I was just discussing with somebody out there. They are just simple little things, guidelines, that we could tell people, if you look at the source, where is this particular thing coming?
Can we pause there, please, so that we can get an answer to how do we know whether content is trustworthy or not?
Yep.
The challenge of legitimacy of information is a really, really difficult one, and I think it is becoming increasingly challenging for people to discern fact from fiction, especially in the disinformation space. This is information that has been deliberately passed along or misconstrued so that people won't understand it. It's just deliberate falsehoods. It is really difficult, and I think there are cultural challenges in relation to different cultures' relationship with information and what they expect. The relationship with the written word in some cultures is very different from others. Others are more sceptical than others. And there are elements of, this really comes down to, I think, trust, where you trust to get your information from. And I suspect that the answer lies not in one solution here, but many. And there's some great organisations. I saw Mandy from Toha Toha over there doing some fantastic work as an NGO around mis and disinformation. And it's that kind of work, I think, which is both at the community level to upskill people and give them those skills, as well as in the formal education system for critical thinking. It's multifaceted.
Okay. I'm under pressure to wrap this now, so I just want to thank you, and I want to thank the panel. We've had one question, which is whether the slides from the presenters will be available after the hui. I haven't asked you, but I'm hoping that the answer is yes. Yes, it looks like that the answer is yes. So thank you very much to everyone.